All right. 3, 2, 1. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Evidence-Based Excellence Podcast, yet again with your host and friendly neighborhood far-right thug, Mr. George Cresswell. Why, what a historic day it is today. It is the 6th of November at time of recording, or rather a day of recording. We have just had the news all around the world, the news that made its way around the world. Donald Trump, DJT, Donald J. Trump, 47th President of the United States. If you care about Western civilization, if you care about freedom, if you care about the whole world not turning into a communist dystopian hellscape, then you are very, very happy with this news. As you can tell, I'm very, very happy with this news. The tears of the left-wing liberals have sustained me and nourished me to no end the last, however many hours. Had the news that he was sort of gaining in the count early hours of this morning. And when I woke up later on, I went back to sleep. When I woke up later on, we had the news that he had been officially declared the winner. And that not only that, the Republicans had taken control completely of the Senate. They'd won the popular vote. He'd won the popular vote. He won everything. Okay, just goes to show how sick and tired people are of the creeping totalitarianism that was making its way around the world. And now people like lame-brained Lammy, and, enemy of the people, Starmer, now having to walk back a lot of the things that they said in the past, particularly with Lammy. People are bringing up this tweet. I'll see if I can put it around here somewhere. People are bringing up this tweet that Lammy made in the past, calling Donald Trump a fascist, a Nazi sympathizer, a KKK sympathizer. So, and then he put a post up today saying, "Congratulations to real Donald Trump."
Oh, no.
Looking forward. Sorry, I'm messing with my jacket here because the collar looked a little bit weird. So, yeah, by the way, for one of these cool evidence-based excellence jackets, please do leave your comments down below. And now I have to walk back that old chestnut and say that he's happy that Donald Trump won. He's looking forward to working with him in the future. Oh, so much pain on the part of Labour right now. Corbyn crying always makes me happy, not gonna lie. But enough about that. That's not the topic of today's episode. That's just a nice little, what's the term I'm looking for? What's the word I'm looking for? Nice thing to start off today's episode, just because it's today. We're hopefully going to look forward to a new era of freedom and prosperity, and hopefully we'll start turning to that way in the UK in the near future. But we potentially got 4.5 years of communist rule before we get ourselves back out of it. But anyway, we're going to be talking today. I put up a thing on my Instagram story 2 days ago whilst I was just finishing up the research for this episode. I'm only now getting around to recording it, about range of motion. And there's going to be a range of motion episode dropping Monday from the time that this is being recorded. That should be, provided there's no technical difficulties or anything like that. That will be on Monday the 11th. The 11th of the 11th. Okay, so that will be dropping on that day. We're going to be talking about one study in particular, range of motion, when we're looking at it for things like hypertrophy, strength, or any other performance outcomes. It's a hotly debated topic. See, some people, you've only got to do a partial range of motion, like 21s were all the rage back when I was first getting into, weight training, resistance training as a young 16-year-old kid. 21s are where you've done 7 reps, quote unquote, in the bottom half of like a bicep curl. And then you've done 7 reps straight after in the top half. So that's like from the fully contracted position down to 90 degrees. And then you do 7 full ones. Apparently this is meant to maximize hypertrophy and all the rest of it. You get the dogmatic approach saying you have to do full range of motion, ass to grass, or it doesn't count. Whatever the hell. Other things people say, depending on what the exercise is, okay. But today we're going to be talking about range of motion because there was a study that came out last year by Wolf and colleagues. I'll read you the full citation in a moment. We're going to be breaking down that study today. It was a massive study. It's a meta-analysis and systematic review. Huge study. We're going to be talking a little bit about some of the statistical concepts and stuff like that, as well as to why they chose the methods that they did. We're going to be breaking down this study all the way from abstract through to some of the background research that they've done, which formed the premise for the question, their methods, their results, and a little bit about the discussion section and what you can take away from it. This is going to be a very, very important episode, particularly if you're a trainer or if you're somebody who wants to train in the gym to maximize strength, hypertrophy, all the rest of it. Okay. So if you want the citation, you can go and find it. It is by Wolf and colleagues. I'm not going to read every single person's name, but it is titled Partial versus Full Range of Motion Resistance Training, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. It came out in 2023. And it is in the International Journal of Strength and Conditioning, issue number 3, volume number 1. Okay. Obviously, the link will be down in the show notes as well. If there's too many references, we've got a good few references to talk about today as well that form like the background and some of the stuff to explain why they used the methods that they did. If there's too many to fit in the show notes, they will be put in an article on my website, which will be linked down in the show notes. You can always go and find the references if you need them. Okay, so let's get straight into it, starting with the abstract. The abstract, because I forgot to put a T in abstract, and I didn't notice. So I'm looking at this. I'm just going to quote you the abstract of the study. Background: range of motion, ROM is the abbreviation, during resistance training is of growing interest and is potentially used to elicit differing adaptations. For example, muscle hypertrophy and muscular strength and power. To date, attempts at synthesizing the data on range of motion during resistance training have primarily focused on muscle hypertrophy in the lower body. Objective: our aim was to meta-analyze and systematically review the effects of ROM on a variety of outcomes, including hypertrophy, strength, sport, power, and body fat type outcomes. Following pre-registration and consistent with PRISMA guidelines, a systematic review of PubMed and Sport Discus was performed. Data was extracted and a Bayesian multi-level meta-analysis was performed. A range of exploratory subgroup and moderator analyses were also performed. Results: the main model revealed a trivial SMD in favor of full range of motion compared to partial range of motion. Not going to go through the exact stats right in this abstract. We're going to go through those when we get to the discussion in the results section. We're going to go through them step by step. When grouped by outcome, standardized mean differences, that's SMDs, all favored full range of motion, but SMDs were trivial to small. Subgroup analyses suggested there may be a muscle hypertrophy benefit to partial range of motion training at long muscle lengths compared to using a full range of motion. Analysis also suggested the exercise... Sorry guys, my brain's not working properly today. Analysis also suggested the existence of a specificity aspect to range of motion, such that training in the range of motion being tested as an outcome resulted in greater strength adaptations. No clear differences were found between upper and lower body adaptations when range of motion was manipulated. Conclusions. Overall, our results suggest that using a full or long range of motion may enhance results for most outcomes: strength, speed, power, muscle size, and body composition. Differences in adaptations are trivial to small. As such, partial range of motion training may present an efficacious alternative for variation and personal preference, or where injury prevents full range of motion training. That is the abstract. So abstracts, not always good just to read an abstract, but an abstract is there as basically a TLDR. Okay. It gives you, everything you need to know about the study to talk about it at a baseline level. Okay. Has key results in there. The most, important results will be in the abstract. If you have a study like this one, where there are so many different results from the subgroup analyses, which we'll be going into, you will not be able to put all those in your abstract, because then your abstract will be too long. Typically, abstracts are 250 words or less. Okay, that's typically the word cap for an abstract. Okay, sometimes you have them longer, depends on what sort of publishing criteria you have. Okay, but oftentimes they're about 250. In my dissertation, 250 words was our limit, and you had to put everything in there in a clear and concise manner. That's all an abstract is designed to do. We're going to get into the study in more detail now, talking about sort of like the background, why they sort of chose to investigate this, a little bit about the past research that's been done, and then we'll get into the methods and the results. And when we get to the results section, we'll be explaining a lot more of the results in the abstract in a lot more detail. It's going to be a lot more useful for you, so please stay tuned. So we're going into the intro and the background. So resistance training, as you commonly know, or as you'll know, is commonly implemented to induce muscle hypertrophy, increase muscular strength, improve other aspects of sporting performance. Okay, depending on where an athlete is in their periodized training cycle, they might have a greater focus on one aspect of resistance training versus another. If they're in a peak, the peak of their season, they might not be doing massive muscle hypertrophy building blocks because they're very fatiguing, they're very high volume, they're going to negatively impact their performance on their weekend performances in the competitions, for example. So they might not be doing that. But then when they're in the off season, for example, that might be when the coaches want to really build their muscular hypertrophy base, because that's going to confer performance benefits of its own. And then once they get into the season, they can taper off and they can just focus on maintaining what they have. Okay, similar to when they want to build like a bulk of cardiovascular fitness. If you want them doing the highest weekly mileages that they can, you're not going to really most likely be doing that in the middle of the season when they've got potentially a weekend fixture and, for example, a fixture in the middle of the week. Sometimes they could be playing 2 or 3 times a week. You know what I mean? So that's not necessarily the best time to do that. In the off season, absolutely. Okay. Range of motion has been a matter of interest due to conflicting data regarding the best ranges of motion to employ for a given training outcome or sport, with some findings suggesting a superiority of full range of motion. As if I ever say the term FROM, okay, FROM is full range of motion, okay? In some contexts, for example, muscle hypertrophy desired in multiple muscle groups. Whereas others have argued that partial range of motion training, and that will, if I abbreviate it and I speak the abbreviation in this podcast, it will be abbreviated to PROM, okay, can be potentially more useful in other contexts, for example, preferential muscle hypertrophy in individual muscles. Both FROM and PROM are effective for eliciting improvements in muscle size. It has been reported previous that FROM is more efficacious for lower body muscle hypertrophy training, for example. That's number 1 in the references. You can go find that either down below or in the article on my website where these references can be found. So I want to give you a quote from a study here by Schoenfeld and Gurjic. I'm sorry if I've pronounced the second guy's name wrong. It says, quote, "To date, 4 studies have investigated the impact of variations in range of motion on hypertrophy of the lower body musculature. These studies generally show that training with a full range of motion produces similar or greater increases in muscle size than training with a partial range of motion. Of the 3 studies that used free weight exercises, 2 studies reported that for the quadriceps muscle, training with a full range of motion may produce greater muscle hypertrophy than training with a partial range of motion." That is from another systematic review that was conducted by Schoenfeld and Gurjic in 2020. Okay, so that was 4 years ago at the time of this recording that was published. But there's another quote coming from them here And it says here, it could be hypothesized that when a certain range of motion threshold is achieved, no additional benefit is obtained by further increases in range of motion of a given exercise. This concept, for example, can be compared with protein intake and muscle protein synthesis. Specifically, increasing protein amounts from 20 to 40 grams likely results in greater increases in muscle protein synthesis. However, additional increases from 40 to 70 grams do not further augment muscle protein synthesis responses. What that's referring there is something normally people get wrong. I think I might have talked about this in my protein episode, which I done a fair while ago. The cap on which will be used for muscle protein synthesis, okay? A lot of people get confused with this, and they think it means that you can only absorb a certain amount of protein per meal. It's not what it means. All it means is that there's a limit on the amount of protein that will be taken from your meal that will be used for muscle protein synthesis, and that is specifically to build muscle. It doesn't mean that any more protein beyond that point you're not going to digest, you're not going to break down, because that's not the way human physiology works. Everything that goes into your stomach will get broken down unless it is unable to, because we lack the enzymatic structure to be able to do it, okay? You know, there's a reason why cows can subsist on a diet of grass, whereas we wouldn't be able to, because they have, you know, a stomach with 4 distinct compartments. They're ruminants, and then they can break that down and get all of the nutrients they need out of that, okay? We can't do that. We have one measly stomach, okay? But what it's saying there is that up to a point, there's only a certain amount that will be used for muscle growth specifically, okay? To maximize muscle growth specifically. It doesn't mean that you're not going to digest the rest of it. Otherwise, you'd literally just be pooping out entire whole chicken breasts, okay? Not what's happening. And that's sort of what they were getting at here, saying maybe there is a cap on where range of motion going beyond a certain point ceases to be more effective for muscle hypertrophy, okay? So for example, let's just say you have a squat and you do it to 60 degrees of knee flexion. 60 degrees of knee flexion, let's just say that. So that would be like a half squat. You're not hitting parallel or anything like that yet, okay? But then you increase it to say 100 degrees or 110 degrees of knee flexion. That might take you just below parallel, okay? So let's say about 100 degrees. That would be greater than a right angle knee bend, okay? So right angle is obviously like that. Well, not quite like that. Perfectly vertical, perfectly horizontal. That's 90 degrees. So if you imagine going 100, it's a little bit greater knee flexion than that. So I think that's correct. Or maybe go into more. I might have got that wrong. Either way, greater knee bend during the squat is what I'm trying to convey. I might have the angles the wrong way around in my brain. Like I said, not working properly today. But either way, greater knee bend from that point, probably going to be better, okay? That's signifying a deeper squat, okay? Let's just say you go from a squat where your knee is sort of at this angle, and then your knee goes to this angle so that your hips are below parallel. Let's just say that. Probably going to get greater results because you get greater tension, greater stretch on the quadriceps, and it's also more difficult, okay? But let's just say you take it from that point then down to a lower point. Question is, are you going to get more benefit from that in terms of muscle growth? And that's where they're saying that maybe there's not only the specificity element, but there's also the element to diminishing returns, basically. You know, you can go lower, happy, more power to you, but you're not necessarily going to get more greater benefit from that, okay? So that's what the main takeaway from that previous systematic review was. Both FROM and PROM have also been suggested to be effective for improving muscular strength, as well as performance outcomes in areas like the counter movement jump, 20-meter sprint time, wind gate test, peak, and also mean power output, okay? Question remains, however, is to whether either is a more or less effective solution than the other, okay? That seems to remain, that the answer to that question remains to be elucidated. Because there are inherent differences, for example, between PROM and full ROM training, okay? So when we're looking at this, for example, got a couple of points I want to talk about. During isometric training, for example, isometric training is where a muscle is in a static contraction, doesn't move under a load, okay? Like a plank or like you're holding a bicep curl at the 90-degree point. Okay, that's an isometric contraction. The muscle isn't lengthening or shortening, but it's also under a load, so it's under some form of resistance, okay? During isometric training, the length at which the contraction is held and the muscle trained impacts resulting adaptations, okay? That's number 2 in the references if you want to go and read that. So I've got some points here which I want to go through it. Isometric training at longer muscle lengths produced greater hypertrophy when compared to equal volumes of shorter muscle length training in this study that we're talking about. Okay, it's number 2, like I said. Good point to mention there. So it seems that if you do an isometric exercise training program, or if you're doing an exercise which you are incorporating isometrics into it, for muscle hypertrophy, you seem to get greater muscle hypertrophy if you hold in the lengthened position. So for your biceps, that would be, when your arm is extended versus when your arm is flexed. Tend to get greater responses from that versus when you're doing it in the shortened position. And it does seem to indicate also that long muscle length training results in greater transference to dynamic performance. Okay, that's a very general term. Dynamic performance could refer to a lot of different things, but again, seems to be highlighting the importance of these long muscle lengths. Okay, keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. Number 2, this is from another study here. It has also been suggested that partial range of motion training may promote greater metabolic stress via increased lactate accumulation and muscle deoxygenation compared to full range of motion training. So that's number 3 in the references. So you have here a couple of takeaways from this study. I did go and read into this study to see what I could find. Okay, so a lot of the surplus references that you'll be finding down below are additional references that I went and found based on what they cited in this review. So what Wolf and Fisher Schoenfeld cited in their study, which is the main study we're talking about. If there was a claim that I wanted to go and investigate, so this is one of them, I would go then and read the study. Ideally, I'd like to find the full text. If I couldn't find the full text, I'd find the abstract, see what the abstract says. If there was nothing useful in the abstract, then I would just go off what they said in the study. Okay, sometimes studies are locked behind paywalls and whatever. So, if you have I have 10 studies here, additional, which I want to talk about. If all of them were locked behind like 50 quid paywalls, that's 500 quid. I haven't got that kind of money to spend. I haven't got that kind of money to spend and go and get the full text. So, sometimes you just got to work with what you've got. So we're looking here. Partial range of motion was shown to significantly increase muscle cross-sectional area versus the full range of motion training of the triceps muscle. Okay, so that's one point. The acute responses of area under the oxygenated hemoglobin curve, blood lactate concentration, and blood lactate concentration were significantly higher both before and after partial range of motion training versus full range of motion training. Only way I can really think that might be would be because if you're doing like a full range of motion bicep curl, for example, there's points in the strength curve. Let's just take a standing bicep curl, for example, a barbell bicep curl. When you're at the bottom of that movement, there's not a lot of tension on the biceps specifically because the weight is being pulled directly down because of gravity and your arm is fully extended by your sides, okay? It's not your biceps that are really resisting that motion. Okay, it's mostly, your grip flexors because they're your hand flexors, forearm flexors, that's the words I'm looking for. Your grip muscles because obviously they're holding the barbell, but then it's mostly like your traps and your shoulders just because you're holding it. It's like you're holding like a rack pull kind of position, okay? When you get to the middle part of the motion, then that's when the strength curve and the tension in the biceps is actually the highest for this particular movement. Now, when you're doing something like an incline biceps curl where you're sat back on a bench and the bench is reclined about 45 degrees, the arm can translate back behind the body, completely different strength curve, okay? So that's why different exercises have different strength curves, and that's where you get peak tension at different points, in the exercises, depending on how your body is oriented, depending on what kind of attachment, what machine you're using, etc., okay? So in a standing biceps curl with the bar, the peak tension is going to be when it's at the midpoint. Now, as you progress past the midpoint up to the point where the bar is close to your shoulder, again, the bar's going straight down, but your forearm is supporting the weight, okay? And the biceps are not really working as hard as they were in the midpoint, and that's often why you get stuck in the midpoint as you get close to failure, because they're supported in that point. So the strength curve basically starts off very low, and then it goes up as you get midway through the movement. That's when it hits its peak, and then it comes back down again. Okay, it's a bit like a normal distribution curve in that instance, Now, if you're only doing it, for example, in this range, just say you're doing it just above and below 90 degrees. So say that's the 90-degree point and you're going just above and just below. Maybe that's why you get that greater metabolic stress because you're contracting your muscles and letting them lengthen, extension. It's not a full range of motion, but you're keeping them in the point for that exercise where it's at the maximum point of that strength curve. And as a result, that's generating a lot more tension very quickly. Okay. So could be one reason as to why. Okay. Mechanistically, it has also been suggested that lactate plays a role in molecular... Oh, this is more to do with the mechanisms of muscle hypertrophy now. So on a mechanistic level, it has been suggested that lactate plays a role in molecular signaling relating to muscle hypertrophy and oxidative metabolism in adult skeletal muscle, with activation likely depending on skeletal muscle type, with the exact mechanisms remaining elusive. Okay, so that's one of the big things, that there's a lot of things that we still don't know. There's a lot of things that we still don't know. Like I said, I was speculating just now. There's a lot of things that we still do not know, okay? And that's not necessarily going to change from this study either, because there's always things that you don't know. And oftentimes what you'll find is that every study that's conducted, at the end of it, will have recommendations for future research, okay? Because there's always more research that needs to be done, okay? And nobody's checking our homework, so to speak, you know? We're never going to know when we have the, 100% of the answers, and we never know if we ever will. So never be surprised if you read a study and you still find things remain to be answered. Okay? Good study leaves a door open for future questions. Range of motion for a specific event or sport or lift demands may also result in increased performance. Okay? So that's another thing that we talked about before. Training, so specificity element, training in the range of motion that you are going to compete with is going to be very, very important. So, for example, here we had variable range of motion intervention. In this study is number 4 in the references. Pardon me. Variable range of motion interventions significantly increase bench press throw displacement and also isokinetic peak force over the control, which was a full range of motion condition. Okay, so these people were varying the range of motion that they were using based on the range of motion that would be applicable to different events and such. And as a result, when they came to test things that would be indicative of performance in those events, they ended up performing if they trained in those varying ranges of motion that were appropriate to that event, rather than just with a standard full range of motion condition. So that's a little bit of background as to what's already been previously done in the field. The aim of the review was to review the data available and meta-analyze it. Okay, it's always a good thing when you can meta-analyze it. And it was also to assess whether full range of motion or various forms of partial range of motion were more or less effective for increasing performance in particularly the realms of hypertrophy, strength, power, and body composition. Okay, so let's have a look at the methods. This is going to be quite an interesting section as well. So, first off, their inclusion criteria. With a meta-analysis, always good to look at the inclusion criteria for the studies that are being included. Okay? So, first off, they had to be in the English language. That's typically a given with a lot of journals, a lot of editorial boards and whatever are based in English-speaking countries, predominantly English-speaking countries. As such, typically when you're looking at this, you look for English language papers. Okay? Also helps minimize translation errors and all stuff like that. They were looking for full text, peer-reviewed articles, and they also opened the door to doctoral or master's theses. They were also able to be included, provided they met the next part of the criteria. So studies had to have at least 2 groups or experimental conditions. 2 groups or experimental conditions using varying ranges of motion. Okay, so you could just simply have full range of motion and a partial range of motion condition, as long as you specify what the partial range of motion condition is. Some studies, they may have full, they might have partial stretched and then partial contracted, all stuff like that, okay? They had to have at least 2. They had to have at least 2, and they had to be different ranges of motion. And they had to measure at least 1 outcome variable of interest, typically to do with muscle size, hypertrophy, strength, body composition, speed, or power, okay? They had to have some sort of measure as an outcome variable. Standard, sports science papers, basically. Standard sports science papers you'd be looking for. Quality assessment. So in this instance, they use what's called a TestX scale. Now, I don't really like this name because when you go in and read the paper, which explains a little bit about it, again, I could only read the abstract because, again, it was a paywalled paper. So they took the capitalized letters for TestX from the middle of some of the words. Normally when you make an anagram of something, you use the first letter of each word, the first initial of each word as the letter in the anagram. Okay, so for test X, for example, you would expect the first letter to start with first word of the anagram to start with T, the second letter of the anagram to start with an E, the third word of the anagram to start with the letter S, and so on. Okay, that's what you would expect. Okay, you know, when you're looking at DOJ, let's just take, because that's quite a hot topic in America right now. DOJ, Department of Justice. D, Department O of J, Justice. Okay, same thing. National Institute of Health. Okay, NIH. National N-I Institute Health H. Okay, that's what we're looking at. But they didn't do it with this. They took like E from like the middle of one of the words, and then they used the EX as like something else at the end. I don't like how they got the name. Okay, done my head in. But anyway, the test X scale is a scale for rating. It's a very good scale, but I don't like the name. Very good scale for rating study quality purely for use in sports science trials. Okay, it is designed for trials that are in the sports science field. When tested, it's demonstrated no significant differences in test X scores for observers, so it's quite good across all observers. Helps account for researcher and observer bias by the seams of it, and all stuff like that. And has almost perfect agreement between 3 observers. Okay, so 3 different observers based on the, like, you know, when they're observing it, the test X scores are very, very similar. Okay, so they demonstrate very good reliability and usefulness. Okay, so it's a 15-point scale, and it gives 5 points to study quality and 10 points to the reporting. Okay, now you can go again, read the article or read the show notes down below. It's number 6. References to go get an idea of what the scale is. It also supposedly accounts for previously unmentioned study criteria specific to exercise training studies. But I'm going to flash this table up for you now. This is the grade table of evidence, okay? So you can see things like the number of studies, study design, risk of bias, inconsistency, indirectness, and all the rest of it. That's in the certainty assessment part. The number of patients or number of participants, subjects, whatever word you want to use. You have the effect. That's when you have these confidence intervals. We'll get onto what they mean in a minute. And then at the end of it, where you have these certainties and importance, you sort of have like a relative, or rather a total, quality rating at the end. Like the 24 randomized control trials that were, where's the study design? They're all randomized control trials in this instance, but they were looking at muscle strength, sport outcomes, power outcomes. So you had 6 looking at power, you had 24 looking at strength, you had 7 looking at sport, you had 8 looking at muscle size, and you had 4 looking at body fat. Okay, and then over on the other side, you have the overall quality score. So all of it ranked moderate to high, which is what we like to see, okay? Not often you sort of find that. Oftentimes you have some studies that are going to obviously be quite low quality in there. Some studies may be very low. Some studies may be very high. Overall, we're looking at moderate to high quality evidence here, which is good to see. Gives us faith, good amount of faith in the results that we're getting here, because the quality of the evidence we're basing it on is good. Obviously, a nice little rule of thumb, which you can look at with regards to meta-analyses, is they can only be as strong as the evidence that make them up. Okay, so like a pyramid, the massive pyramid structure can only be as strong as the bricks that made it. Okay, data extraction. So this is where you get into seeing how much they actually took into account when they did the study. Okay, so there's so many different data points they took. So from the studies that met the inclusion criteria, there was 23 in the end. They extracted all of the following, or they ended up getting points for all of the following: study design, weighted mean age, weighted mean height, intervention duration, participant sex, training status, population, range of motion used by the partial range of motion group or condition, range of motion used by the full range of motion group or condition, proportion of sets being performed with full or partial range, muscle length trained, mean repetition set number, mean number of sets, mean repetition duration, number of exercises, mean proximity to muscular failure, mean load, training modality, and auxiliary factors, and whether exercises were performed in addition to those in which the ROM is manipulated. So if there was an exercise in which the range of motion was being manipulated to see the effects on it, did they do any other exercises in addition to those in like the same session in which could have had adverse effects on the study or whatever? So many things taken into account, okay? And this is typically what you get when you have so many different study designs, so many different studies looking at different things. you're obviously going to get a lot of surplus data as well. And obviously they had to extract and take into account all of this because they had to do the co-founder assessment, basically. So after extraction, these outcomes were grouped into one of the following categories: body composition outcomes, strength outcomes, power outcomes, and sport outcomes. Okay. Potential bias towards one measure, so for example, full range of motion, if there were a lot of studies biased towards full range of motion, were also noted were appropriate. That's something which you would expect, really, because there's a lot less data available on partial range of motion than there is for full range of motion. So you'd expect a lot of the data to be biased towards full range of motion just simply because there's so much more of it. But then finally, we're going on to the actual meta-analysis part. So this is where we explain how they've done their meta-analyses. So I'm going to try and explain this to you as best that I can now in a way that's going to make it understandable. So they use the estimation-based approach with confidence intervals, okay? So I'm going to explain to you a little bit about what an estimation-based approach is. Let's try this again, huh? Let's try this again. An estimation-based approach was opted for the meta-analysis. This means it was decided that the use of confidence intervals, as they're called, would be better for interpreting the results rather than the use of a simple p-value. Now, we've talked about p-values before. The p-value of less than 0.05 or equal to 0.05 as a measure of significance. Basically, you hit that threshold, that gives you the criteria that you need to potentially reject the null hypothesis, which is the opposite of what your hypothesis is, what you don't expect, or what you don't think is going to happen, okay? Or you don't think is the case. Typically, a lot of the studies that are done, randomized control trials, for example, is kind of weird because there's a couple of ways that you can prove something, okay? And one of the ways you can, in a way prove something is to be able to reject the opposite of it, okay? That's what we call rejecting the null hypothesis. That's what a lot of studies are based on doing, because if we can reject the null hypothesis, it gives us evidence for what our hypothesis was. And so when you have a p-value of less than 0.05, gives you less than a 5% chance of it being something other than the intervention, gives you good evidence that you can reject the null hypothesis. But that's not what was used here for such a large and various data set, okay? Here, the authors were trying to measure not only whether there was a significant difference between conditions, but also the size of the differences measured, okay? So they were aiming to do more than just say yes or no. They were aiming to say, I'm sorry, my hair is really, I'm having a very terrible hair day today. They were aiming to also say how much did they differ, okay? And that's where confidence intervals and standard mean differences come into application, okay? So confidence intervals, a little bit like a standard error of measurement in a way. It's basically like a field around the result in which we have like a 95% certainty that the true difference between groups lies in this range, okay? So it's typically, up and down bars from like the mean average result. And we know that the true difference, depending on what our confidence interval is decided to be, we can say with 95% certainty, for example, that the true value lies within these top and bottom ranges, okay? So it's like I said, a field around the true result of differences between conditions in which if we were to run many identical experiments with different populations of the same interest, for example, diabetics and non-diabetics with blood pressure, for example, that's actually the example I'm going to be showing you in a second, that the true difference between the two conditions would be somewhere in this field, okay? 95, and that's typically why you see a 95% confidence interval being used when you're looking at meta-analyses and stuff, of values fall within 2 standard deviations of the mean value, okay? So outside of that, you have only 5% of the data points left that will be outside of those 2 standard deviations, okay? So that's what it means that only 5% of the time we would expect to find the true difference between the groups fall outside of this range. So I'm going to show you this graph now. This is from Gardner and Altman, and this is all the way back in 1986. As you can see, the graph looks quite old. But you can see diabetics, non-diabetics, and you can see systolic blood pressure in millimeters of mercury on the left-hand side, okay? On the right-hand side then, you have a difference in mean systolic blood pressure in the millimeters of mercury again. But if you have a look at the mean value for the diabetics and the non-diabetics, you have a difference here of 6. The mean difference between the groups is 6.0. Now, the 95% confidence interval based on those 2 standard deviations would tell us that we can say with 95% certainty that the true difference between these two groups is going to fall somewhere between that -1 and that 13 above the 6. Okay? The average that we measured here was 6, but taking into account that we're estimating it, the true value we can say within 95% is going to be, with 95% certainty rather, and 95% confidence, is going to be within that 13 to -1 range. Okay, that's what that means. That's that field around that average. And I'm going to show you this other one here then. This is from the same paper, but it's difference in mean systolic blood pressure again. And this is how your confidence intervals will change depending on how much certainty you want to say the true value is between. Okay, so for example, if you drop your confidence interval to 90%, then you can say with 90% certainty that the true value is going to be between somewhere 1.9 and 10.1. You narrow the field a little bit, but you can't be as certain that it's there. You can only be 90% certain, not 95. Okay? So again, you can bring the field in, but you can't be as certain that it's actually within that field. Okay? Now, you can do the same thing here. You can widen the field, widen your confidence interval, but then obviously there's greater little variation around that result. If you go to 99% confidence, you want to say that it's nearly 100% confident that it's within 0.5, minus 0.5 and 12.5 at the top. Well, it's quite interesting here is that this minus 0.5 would actually indicate potentially a non-significant difference, okay, if it is within there. So it is also possible, well, we'll get on to now, to infer significant differences from the confidence interval without giving this direct measure of it in terms of a p-value or directly testing for it. If the 0 point, for example, with the point where there would be no difference between the means is outside of the used confidence interval, meaning there is no negative on the CI scale at the bottom. Okay, if there's no negative on the confidence interval scale, then this highlights an inferable statistically significant difference between the means. If there is a negative on the confidence interval, for example, i.e. confidence interval of 95 minus 1.2 to 3.5, this indicates that potentially the p-value is greater than the percentage remaining outside of the confidence interval specified, meaning with a 95% confidence interval, that leaves the 5% then, that p-value, but it would be greater. Okay, it's greater than 5%. That means that it's potentially not a significant difference. Okay, that's just a little bit about confidence intervals when you're reading papers. Okay, it's a little bit like your standard measure of error and where you are confident that the true mean lies. Okay, the true difference lies in this range that you have. And typically, if you want to say with greater certainty that it lies within this range, your range has to be bigger. Okay, you can say with less certainty that it lies here, but obviously less certainty is not what we want. We want to get the true value. Okay. Then we're looking at this new Bayesian approach. Okay, also known as the new statistics. This new statistics approach aims to emphasizes a shift of emphasis away from null hypothesis significance testing. Okay, so moving away from this disproving the null hypothesis method to what is called estimation based on effect sizes, confidence intervals, and meta-analysis. I made a mistake there. Let's get rid of. There we go. Hit the wrong button. There we go. What this is done in effort to is to break away from the black and white thinking of is there an effect or not? Okay. Sometimes that can be useful, don't get me wrong, but sometimes it's also useful to ask if there's a smaller effect or, sometimes the answer isn't necessarily always black and white. You know what I mean? Can also be used to create an approach that incrementally improves estimates of magnitudes and uncertainty over time when it comes to ascertaining differences in treatment or training groups. Okay? It will improve and get incrementally better over time is the idea as well. For example, the big advantage with Bayesian methods versus frequentist methods, a frequentist method would be something known as something like the null hypothesis testing, is that frequentist methods can only really reject the null hypothesis based on the evidence, not say whether the evidence or not is in favor of a hypothesis or not. Okay, so as I said, you're disproving what you don't think is going to happen. Okay, and whilst that does provide evidence that potentially what you think is true, it's not necessarily a direct proof. Okay, I'm actually no, have I got that right? This is where I really got to think now, because I don't know actually if I've got that right, because you can have proof by contradiction. Okay, obviously you can prove, if you can prove a contradiction, that's another way of proving it. They do it in mathematics all the time, whereas, for example, they do it with the square root of 2 and why it cannot be expressed as a fraction. Okay, because if you try to express it in its simplest possible terms, you end up with both terms being even. And if you have both terms being even, you cannot have it in its lowest possible terms, because for a fraction to be in its lowest possible terms, it at least has to have one odd number. Okay? Because if you've got two even numbers, you can divide it by 2 and you get a simple fraction, but you can't do that with the square root of 2, for example. So that is a proof by contradiction. You can show that the simplest possible way you can express square root of 2 as a fraction, it would be both places being even, but you can't have a simple fraction with both numbers being even, and so that's a contradiction. That's proof by contradiction. You can have that as well. They do it in maths all the time. But Bayesian methods inherently compare the null hypothesis to many other hypotheses, okay? And so it does not have this same flaw. It also allows for greater precision of estimation, okay? For meta-analyses, which are a form of hierarchical model, natural descriptions for a kind of data, Bayesian methods can be very useful. They typically confer greater ease of interpretation of the data, and so greater confidence in data outputs and potential conclusions offers greater flexibility of specification of the overall complex hierarchical model, and also allows for more appropriate quantification of the uncertainty around effect estimates, as well as facilitating a clear understanding of variation between studies. So there's a lot of good reasons to why they might use a Bayesian approach for their meta-analysis. That was basically their methods section. I know I sort of stumbled over that a little bit. I don't do a lot of talking really into the background of the statistical concepts. I'm by no means a statistician. I want to say that. We done, stats modules when I was in uni, but by no means am I a statistician. This is just from reading some of the studies that they referenced in their paper. And obviously, if I got anything slightly wrong, which I'm always prone to do, obviously you guys might know. Please do let me know. If there's something I got wrong there, please do let me know. I'm always open to improving. So again, into the results section now. This is the main section that I wanted to talk about. So if we just go into the a bit of summary of characteristics to start off with range of motion. So obviously range of motion varied study to study. Some studies used mechanical stops on machines, such as isokinetic dynamometers. They can stop the machine at certain points, so they always know what the range is. Some mechanical stops were used on bars and stuff like that to delineate the partial ranges of motion desired. In others, it was less defined, okay, and partial ranges of motion were corroborated via supervision and assessment on the part of the scientist or the researcher observing the session. Method is valid, but is obviously a lot more prone to error than the others, because obviously we can very, very easily make mistakes. Okay, the error is going to be a lot more with just supervision rather than something which actually delineates this is 30 degrees of joint angle or something like that. For some studies, a certain degree of range of motion was deemed to be full, regardless of what the individual's full capable range of motion was. Okay. So, for example, somebody that can squat to a certain depth and somebody that cannot, they would say the full range of motion is this particular range of motion, regardless of if that person, the one person, can go deeper than the other person can, okay? So some studies, they had a specified range of motion that was deemed full, regardless of what the individual was capable of, okay? And the majority of studies only examine partial ranges of motion in the shortened position, okay? In comparison, there is a sparse evidence for moderate and long muscle lengths, okay? So that's something you need to take into account as well. Evidence far more heavily skewed in the partial range towards the shortened rather than the lengthened position. So, for the meta-analysis, all outcomes. I'm going to put this forest plot up somewhere now. The main outcome model across these 23 studies pardon me, revealed a trivial standard mean difference, which is basically the measure of effect size, in favor of full range of motion versus the partial range of motion. You had an average standard mean difference of 0.12, so very trivial. And your 95% confidence interval, the mean difference lands somewhere from minus 0.02 to 0.26. Okay, so at the top end, say with confidence that there is a small standard mean difference, okay, because it's over 0.2 at the top end. But the average mean was very trivial, very small difference across all of the outcomes. But the subgroup analysis is where it's going to start getting really interesting. This is where we start looking at specifics, okay? So we're looking at group by outcome type, okay? We're going to go through this forest plot now as well. We've got a lot of forest plots and graphs to go through. But we're going to look at strength. So these outcomes are grouped by like power, strength, muscle size, stuff like that. So strength was the average measure, or the measure being used was the 1 rep max test. There was also a trivial standard mean difference in favor of full range of motion versus partial range of motion. You're looking at a standard mean difference of 0.14, and the 95% confidence interval was in the range of minus 0.01 to 0.29. Very similar to the one we just went over. Sport, e.g. sprint time, very much the same. Trivial SMD in favor of full range of motion versus partial range of motion. Standard mean difference only 0.02. Very, very, very small. Okay, and the confidence interval was basically even on both sides. Minus 0.22 to 0.26. Power, you're looking at rate of force development as the measure for this one. So you had trivial SMD in favor of full range of motion versus partial range of motion. Standard mean difference of 0.19. Okay, so verging on a small difference between the two. Confidence interval 0.01 to 0.37. Okay, so that's actually completely on the favors full range of motion side. Muscle size, so muscle cross-sectional area. Again, another quite trivial one, so 0.04, just above the sprint time one. Confidence interval minus 0.17 to 0.25. And body fat, very trivial again, in favor of full range of motion. So all of these favor in full range of motion. The last one, standard mean difference of 0.12, 95% confidence interval minus 0.36 to 0.6. Okay, so very wide on that last one. And you can actually see that by looking at the forest plots, okay? So these ones here, guys, these error bars, these black error bars actually show you the 95% confidence interval. So we can say with 95% confidence that the true difference between partial and full range of motion lies somewhere along this line, okay? So that's what we're saying. The true difference could lie somewhere on the partial side for all of them, really, except the power one, okay? For all of them except really the power one in this data set. But again, the confidence interval gets very close to it, gets very, very close to it. So now we're looking at the study design. So this is just where they analyzed it to see whether there were differences between studies that used a within participant design or between participant design. So what this means is that if it's a within participant design or within group design, they use the same participants in both trials. However, it was the contralateral limb that was exposed to the varying range of motion. So what that means is that they had one arm that would do a designated full range of motion. If it's a bicep curl, for example, they would have the other arm do a partial range. And that's how they test it. They test the difference between the two. Can be useful if you haven't got enough participants to do we done it in our study, for example, because we had a very small sample size and we needed a control condition. So we actually did this. We had a washout period and we randomized the groups so that some of them would come in and be the control condition and then do their experimental condition a week later. Some of them would be the opposite. It was completely randomized. We had nothing to do with it. But they had to act as their own controls because we didn't have enough to have a full control condition. Okay. Can run into problems sometimes because you get greater likelihood that if you do it this way, that your participants are going to have differences at baseline. And that's never really something that you want. If you have a significant differences in your participant characteristics at baseline, that can throw everything off. That can throw everything in your study off. We nearly had that in our dissertation, and that would have meant we would have had to do something called an ANCOVA in order to account for that. But we didn't have to, luckily, in the end. The difference between the two groups wasn't significant. So that was always good. Ideally, for example, you'd want something like a between participant or between group condition where you have different participants in different ranges of motion treatment groups, or you have an experimental and control condition. So you have, within participant designs, you have trivial standard mean difference in favor of full versus partial. So you have 0.22. Confidence interval goes all the way down to minus 0.16 to 0.6. So more skewed towards the full range of motion side, but again, still having that confidence interval creeping over. Same thing with this one. You have a trivial standard mean difference in favor of the full range versus the partial range, 0.1 and then minus 0.06 and 0.25 for your confidence interval. So that's just what happens when you differentiate it by study design. This is quite an interesting one. Proximal and distal hypertrophy. So very, very wide on this one. I'm not sure what the number of studies they had for looking at this kind of thing was like, but typically what you'll find is that when you have a very wide forest plot like this, I'll probably put it down here or something so you can see this. You can see that the graph is very wide, okay? Now, as you get more and more studies and more data points, this will likely narrow, okay? Because with more data points, you get more certainty. So I think there might have been like a sparseness of information available, especially when you consider how wide these error bars, these confidence intervals are. So again, a trivial standard mean difference in favor of proximal. So proximal hypertrophy would be hypertrophy in the 50% of the muscle between the origin and 50%. Okay, so the part that's close to you. So if you have your bicep, for example, let's have a look. So you have your bicep. So my bicep is that long. Proximal, I'm going to denote it on the camera now, would be from this range closest to my shoulder. The top 50% closest to your shoulder. The distal range then would be the 50% from the middle of the muscle down to where it inserts at your elbow. Okay, that's the point. Trivial for both of them. Actually, no, it wasn't trivial for both of them. So you had trivial for the proximal. So you had a 0.17 standard mean difference in favor of full range of motion. Then you had a 95% confidence interval, minus 1.29 to 1.72. Okay, so we know it lies somewhere in that range. Distal, you actually had a small effect in favor of full range of motion. So it's actually slightly bigger. You had a standard mean difference of 0.32, but you still had that 95% confidence interval going all the way to minus 1.14 and up to 1.86. So again, you can't really say anything with certainty, okay? Effective modality. Nothing really changed with effective modality. All of these differences were trivial, aside from a combination in which it was a small change, but all of them favored full range of motion versus partial range of motion. You can see here from the graph, you had a standard mean difference in the resistance machines exclusive of 0.17. In free weights exclusive, it was 0.05, so it was even closer to just being completely, split between the two. Combination, you had a small in favor of full range of motion versus partial, 0.27. But again, all of them had these negatives on the confidence interval. So again, can't really say too much. So it doesn't look like modality makes that much of a difference. Upper body versus lower body. So obviously one of the main things we looked at before was that there was a disparity between upper body and lower body. Okay. So when we're looking at this upper body, so you have a trivial standard mean difference in favor of full versus partial, 0.07, minus 0.18, and plus 0.33 for your confidence interval. Lower body, trivial standard mean difference in favor of full range of motion versus partial range of motion, 0.1, minus 0.07, and then plus 0.27. So again, stuff that we'd expect, really, all slightly in favor of full range of motion versus the partial range of motion. Then you have the outcome bias assessment. So this is, again, pretty much what you would expect. So outcomes, whether they were biased towards the full or the part. So in studies that had a part range of motion bias, you found a small bias towards partial range of motion outcomes. Okay, kind of what, sometimes to be expected. Okay. Studies that you had no clear bias, okay, that pretty much split it straight down the middle, trivial, 0.02. But then in studies that had a full range of motion bias, you had a small standard mean difference towards full range of motion outcomes being over partial range of motion. Okay. So if anything, at least you could say the biases were pretty much evenly split across all of the conditions. Okay, but it's always good. It always adds a bit of credibility to the results when they do a bias assessment like this. This is the main bit that you'll be interested in. Now, this is the result that makes this study very, very interesting. Okay. Spoke a lot about how the vastness of the research available vastly is biased, or rather is in greater number on the shortened partials side. Okay. So now we're looking at muscle length and muscle hypertrophy. So you had partial range of motion interventions were categorized as training muscle groups at either short or long ranges of motion. Okay? Short muscle lengths were taken when, or were used, or were extrapolated, calculated, whatever the word you want to use, when the average assumed muscle length during the partial range of motion condition was lower during the full range of motion condition. So basically, the average length was less than what is being used in the full range of motion condition. Okay, and that typically denotes this range. So if you're doing a bicep curl, again, it's this top part here. That would be the short. That would be the short muscle length. Long muscle length, or when the average assumed muscle length during the partial range of motion exercise was longer than during the full range of motion condition. Okay, that would be when you're doing your partials with your bicep, for your bicep with your arm extended, for example. So when we had short muscle lengths, there was a trivial standard mean difference in favor of full range of motion when the partial range of motion was performed at the short lengths. Like I said, so 0.08, and you had the confidence interval minus 0.24 to 0.42 on either side. Oh, did I not get the screenshot of the graph? Oh, hold on. I don't think I got the screenshot of the graph. Let me make sure. I didn't get the... Oh, I didn't get a screenshot of the graph. Well, I need to go back and get a screenshot of the graph before I move into the editing process. Oh, well, glad I remembered that. However, when you get to long muscle lengths, there was a small standard mean difference in favor of partial range of motion versus full range of motion for muscle hypertrophy, when partial range of motion performed at long muscle lengths. And we're talking here a standard mean difference of minus 0.28. And you had a confidence interval of minus 0.81 to 0.16. Okay? Now that's quite surprising. That's a hell of a result, you know? That actually, in this one instance, it may seem that these types of partial ranges of motion may even be more effective than full range of motion. It's quite interesting. For muscle hypertrophy, take into account. That's for muscle hypertrophy. And that was it mainly for the results section. The rest of it was looking at sort of like the confounders and stuff. But there's not really too much to talk about. None of the confounders like height, time of the set, intervention duration, none of them really had any significant effects. All of the effects of these auxiliary variables were quite trivial. So we don't really need to talk too much about those. You can go read the full paper to look into those if you want to. But let's look at the discussion section. So we're getting towards the end of this now. So obviously, let's just recap what we've been through. Trivial to small standard mean differences are observed in all outcomes in favor of full range of motion. Okay. However, different ranges of motion can be potentially appropriate for different goals or different demands. As I said, if only a partial range of motion is needed, such as in a powerlifting 1 rep max squat, and this is the example the authors give, it would appear that training in that specific range of motion may improve performance by trivial to small margin. And obviously, if you're in the competitive fields and you want any little bit of performance increases you can get, that's going to be very, very important. That's going to be very, very important. When you get to, competition, every little thing counts. Every little thing matters. Principle of specificity does seem to certainly apply, though the effect seems to be more modest than initially assumed. Okay, so previously they might have said that you have to train in this range if you want to be proficient at this event. You have to train in this range. You cannot go outside of this range. People have been dogmatic about range of motion in the past. It does seem that it does give you a little bit more modest benefit than what's been previously suggested. As such, it would be okay to train in other ranges of motion, deeper ranges of motion, for example, than just the range of motion that you compete in. But the principle of specificity does matter. Your event, training for your event specifically does matter, absolutely. However, full range of motion, as a general rule, does provide a good default strategy, basically. All outcomes, when subgrouped, even, favored full ranges of motion by trivial to small margins. Okay? So at the very least, you could say that one is effective as the other, and to reinforce good technique, especially if you're a beginner, to make sure you're not trying to use weight that's too heavy for you and cause injury, using a full range of motion and committing to using a full range of motion can be a good default strategy. Okay? Doesn't have to be binary, necessarily. Some training can be full range of motion. Other training can be partial, depending on what your periodization and program design is like. Okay? To start off with, it might be just a good rule of thumb just to do everything with the fullest range of motion that you can safely until you build up that foundation. Then you can start worrying about using partial ranges and all the rest of it. Let's plug my laptop in because it's getting low on battery. For muscle hypertrophy, however, there does seem, this is quite an interesting finding, to be a distinct advantage to using partial range of motion at long muscle lengths versus shorter ones. Okay? That means is that the partial range of motion for muscle hypertrophy is most effective in the muscle's stretched position, not the contracted position. Okay? When the muscle is under intense stretch. Okay? So let's look at some of the reasons why this may be. So, longer muscle lengths generally appear to result in greater passive tension as passive tissues begin to reach maximal length and provide resistance to further increases in muscle length. Tension itself has been suggested to be an activator of the mTOR pathway, the mTORC1 pathway, the mammalian target of rapamycin pathway, okay? A pathway significantly associated with muscle hypertrophic signaling and muscle growth and processes, okay? This may explain the effect when it's in the lengthened position and you're under that intense stretch, that passive stretch, or even potentially like an active stretch if it's with like a weight or a cable machine, for example. Doing partial range of motion in those lengths can increase the degree of tension and as a result increases muscle hypertrophy, okay? In addition to what we said before, where we talked about the addition of the metabolic stress, additional metabolic stress as well, for example, okay? Stretch-mediated hypertrophy is also an emerging area of study, okay? Some authors, for example, have shown that maximal intensity stretching is also a potent hypertrophy stimulating stimulus, okay? Hypertrophy promoting stimulus. An example of high-intensity stretching to induce muscle damage was, an example previously, this is the reference number 10, which you can find. High-intensity stretching to induce muscle damage was comparable to the effects of mechanical loading, leading to significant increases in muscle hypertrophy. Although this is likely serial hypertrophy, the increase of sarcomeres in serial. Okay, that means along the length of the fiber, basically, not in parallel, which I think of increases in muscle cross-sectional area. Okay, can be good, for example. Serial hypertrophy is kind of the thing you want to be going for when, if you've had an injury, for example, and you've had a part of your body immobilized for quite a while, what can happen is atrophy can occur, obviously, and that can occur serially and in a parallel fashion. And that's where you lose some of your range of motion. So this can be good, for example, if you want to restore some of that range of motion that you had before. The effect of full range of motion may have been overstated in previous research due to a relative sparse amount of research available when past reviews have been conducted. As I said, only one done on the lower body musculature was typically done in the past, for example. More research does need to be conducted on the assessment of long-length partial ranges of motion to draw definitive conclusions, but it does appear that the dogma placed on full range of motion previously may have been an overemphasis. Okay? And this is the good thing, is that when we do studies like this and we look back at things that we were saying in the past, we can say that, oh, I didn't know this back then, so I can now augment my practice. I can now improve my practice going forward. I can actually take advantage of this new training system that we now have access to, and we now have evidence to support, for example. Amazing stuff. Based on the data, two viewpoints are offered by the authors. For the researcher, it may be that range of motion can be regarded as a relatively inconsequential variable, due to many of these analyses being underpowered and the research into range of motion still being in its relative infancy. Okay, lacking enough meaningful data to draw a true consensus. Okay, that's from a researcher perspective. However, of more value to practitioners and trainers is the second viewpoint they offer. Using one range of motion versus another has little to no practical downside. Okay, even if the benefit of one strategy over another seems to be small, it's still relatively uncertain. It is still potentially worth adopting, at least maybe to a certain extent, okay, and maybe taking advantage of in certain circumstances, provided there are no other reasons why it cannot be used or why it cannot be applied, such as load availability in your gym or injury management, maybe, okay? So, for example, although your ego might take a hit, you know, if you, or you might feel a bit weird going into the gym, if you're just going to go into the gym and do these bottom range partials, you can go into it knowing that there's no practical downside to it. There's no evidence to say it's not going to be effective. So why not? Or even if that's the case, why not incorporate both? Okay? Like I said, some can be full range, some can be partial range. You don't have to be committed fully one to the other. You know what I mean? So you can incorporate both and potentially get the best of both worlds and get the best, strongest physique that you're capable of getting with your potential. You know what I mean? Practitioners may also recognize the value in small effects whose existence is relatively uncertain, as even these potential gains may be meaningful to coaches and athletes, whether they be recreational or competitive. So there's things to be gained by everybody. You know, by opening your mind, by opening up the horizon that you have on your training in this way with regards to range of motion, there's a lot of potential gains to be made, meaningful gains. And that's obviously going to be meaningful if you're a coach, if you're an athlete, if you're a gym goer. There's a lot of things that you can take advantage of here. A lot of things that you can incorporate into your training program to keep it interesting, to keep it effective, maybe make it more effective. It might be a novel stimulus, for example, if you've never done anything like this before. But I'm quickly going to pull up the paper one more time, just so I can read the concluding remarks. Why won't this open? Uh-oh, hold on a minute. Why won't this open? It won't actually open the paper. This is annoying. Here we go. Here we go. Right, got there. We got there in the end. So I'm going to skip down to the conclusion section. So that's the end of the discussion section. Obviously, I advise you to go and read this paper. Very, very good paper. As I recommend you do that with any study that we talk about. Recommend you go and read all the references that I referenced down below as well. By no means is this the comprehensive list of all the references that were contained within the paper. You should go and read all of them, obviously, if you have the time. It's going to take you a long time. But, you know, ideally, in an ideal world, that's what we would do. But obviously, not everybody has the time to do that. Anyway, in conclusion, full range of motion outperformed partial range of motion for all outcome types, but effect sizes range from trivial to small, standard mean differences at best. It appears that there may be small differences in outcomes depending on exactly how range of motion was manipulated. For example, short versus long muscle lengths for regional hypertrophy. So coaches and athletes may wish to adopt the range of motion strategy most appropriate to their goals. The principle of specificity likely also applies to range of motion, such that training should usually replicate the range of motion of the outcome of interest. While using a full range of motion approach may be a good default approach, overall, these results suggest that a variety of ranges of motion can be used to good effect, whether that be due to injury management or personal preference. Let me see. Do I need to read this last bit? Here you go. So this is where we're talking about directions for future research. The researchers will be interested in seeing future studies compare the adaptations following partial range of motion training at different muscle lengths compared to full range of motion. For example, a study examining muscle thickness adaptations following resistance training in 2 partial ranges of motion conditions at different muscle lengths and 1 full range of motion condition. For ease of future analysis and or replication, future research should also ensure data is either openly available or at least easier to extract. Failing this, efforts should be made to provide data upon request. So, there you go. There you go. So that's the ins and outs of the study, basically. So as you can see, you can have a little stretch, or big stretch. Range of motion, potentially important variable, but potentially very much misunderstood in the way that we talked about it before, where a lot of people say you have to do full range of motion, you have to do the squat variation in which your arse goes through the floor and touches the earth's mantle and all the rest of it. Obviously, a good rule of thumb is to do things to the full range of motion, especially in the length and stretch position as you can. That's a good rule of thumb. But provided you're not limited by injury or load availability or anything like that. So, yeah, I suppose that's it for this episode. So as far as it goes, what practical recommendations have we got? So what I say is, as a general rule of thumb, just stick with your full range of motion training as the backbone of your training, especially if you are a beginner. You just want to get into the gym and do the basics right. Don't worry about, partial ranges of motion or all of this other big sciencey stuff or anything, okay? You just want to get into the gym, build a habit of doing the exercises well with good technique, finding the best technique for you, and just making sure you're challenging yourself in the gym. That's what you want to do. Once you build a bit of experience, maybe then you can start incorporating some of these other techniques in which we use partial ranges of motion and all the rest of it. By all means you can do. I wouldn't necessarily recommend just doing partial ranges of motion and trying to jack up the weight as high as you can and not doing the full range, or at least not doing it in the way that most people do it, which is in the shortened position. Okay, I've got a feeling you will likely be leaving a lot of gains on the table doing it that way if you're only doing your bench press in like this part of the range of motion, but trying to stack up like 5 plates either side, like I see some people do on the machines in the gym. You're going to do bottom range partials, carry on, you still rack up some heavy weight to do some bottom range partials, more power to you. That's probably going to be the better. That's going to be the better option than doing them at the top, absolutely. But for the most part, it's just going to be good amount of load, good weight being used, full range of motion, and occasionally incorporating some of these partial techniques, particularly if you hit like concentric failure on your full range of motion, but then you could do some partial ranges of motion in the end range. That's going to be like, absolutely tremendous for you. So that's why I would recommend doing those from time to time. Obviously, you've got to be careful when you hit concentric failure. When you hit full failure, for example, you try to go beyond that in terms of partial ranges and stuff. You've got to come with every then effort beyond that. You're racking up fatigue in a massive way. And obviously, in order for you to adapt, you've got to dissipate that fatigue first. Your body has to dissipate that fatigue. So you have to practice, experiment with it. But yeah, there's no reason why you can't do that. Don't be dogmatic about range, I suppose. But ideally, you should be getting into the bottom ranges of your movements, okay? Squats, lunges, bench press especially, things like those. Really get into the bottom range. Really take advantage of the stretch. Don't leave things on the table. Basically. So yeah, that'll do it for me today, guys. I know it's a bit all over the place today. Feeling quite tired. At the minute. Got a lot of things on. So yeah, apologies if this was all over the place. Probably was. But I hope you find it useful. Obviously, go read the study. Follow some of the authors on social media. They're great. They're constantly putting up stuff about new papers that are coming down the line. I think I first found out about this paper from Menno Henselmans, but I follow Milo and Brad Schoenfeld on Instagram. So there's always new studies coming out. They're always showing new things that they publish in. So yeah, if you want to know what new studies coming down the pipeline ASAP, I advise you to follow some of these gentlemen. And yeah, thank you very much, guys. I hope you find this useful. I know I certainly did reading the study. I certainly did. And hopefully we'll have some more interesting research coming out down the pipeline very soon. Hopefully. But yeah, thank you very much, guys. Hope you enjoy today, and hope if you're living in America, you enjoy this newfound freedom that you've got. Please pray for us in the UK if you want to come and liberate us, if you want to come and manifest destiny and, 1776 us, then please feel free. A lot of us are not going to complain. You'll get the lefty lunatics that'll complain because they're losing their grip on socialist communists to still be in power. But a lot of us would really love for that to happen. So I leave it over to you. Anyway, guys, have a good day. Thank you very much. And yeah, wherever you are, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Hope you're having an amazing day. Take care and Godspeed.